how does an economist, and this is of course very important to law, how does an economist deal with people whose careers have been designed in such a way as to minimize incentives in the ordinary sense? So judges, all judges are paid the same. You know, you can't get a raise by being a good judge. You have life tenure. Or jurors, they're brought in. They can't be punished for being lazy and falling asleep and giving goofy results. So can an economist say anything about the behavior of these? I mean, the professors have tenure, but you know, they can get higher salaries, or they can write books and so on. But how does an economist deal with people where it seems that the object is to strip them of incentives?
Well, I mean, economists can deal with it. The questions that one would ask would be, of course, are there any other incentives that you can provide people? Somebody who becomes a judge usually is giving up, or at least often is giving up greater income that they could make in private practice. So they like this activity, okay? And they get hope. They're not doing it simply because they can rest and they don't have to do any work. Their clerks can do it. Some of them maybe is in that capacity, but they like the power, the responsibility, the opportunities, whatever would come in that. And therefore, you know, they're still, economists say they're still maximizing. It isn't a monetary income they're maximizing. Now, how do you create good incentives for people in that?
Well, or even how do you understand their behavior? Yeah, suppose they're maximizing, you know, prestige and leisure and some intrinsic interest in the job or power, or deference, and so on. But how does one? Isn't that kind of empty? It doesn't tell you how they're going to decide.
Well,
cases,
no, but we can deal often. You know, consumers don't maximize money, but we look at changes in costs of engaging in various activities, and I think that's what you want to do with judges. So let's say you take away all the clerks of judges. What kind of, how much time will they put into it? What kind of effort would they put into it? This would be one type of implication on it. A judge might be overturned on review. Now, is that going to affect them? Well, that will depend upon, you know, how, if that's part of the maximum, then you would say if a judge is embarrassed by being overturned, this is a sign that they're a bad judge if they keep getting overturned, and this is a value, then you would predict if there's a greater tendency, your cases, a certain type of cases which you think are likely to go and be reviewed by the higher court, and therefore you might be overturned. You would predict different decision-making then, maybe for cases where you know nobody's going to bother to look at these cases, they're too insignificant or whatever the criterion are for that. So that would be another implication you would get. Would it make a difference whether judges run for office or whether they're appointed? Some states judges run, some they appoint.
Most actually. There's some form of election for most states.
Yeah. Okay. So that you examine that. Some crazy economists have suggested that even federal judges should only have a fixed term. Right?
Yes, I know.
Would that make
take my job away?
Yeah. Would that make a difference if they had 14-year, maybe renewable terms, or 14-year terms, the way the Federal Reserve officials have, as opposed to lifetime, which is in the Constitution, right? So it makes it harder, you know, to analyze it. But I don't think it makes it empty. I think you can get implications out of it, because the thing that economists have going for them, that the economic approach, I should say, it's not just economists, but the economic approach has going for it, is that people are maximizing. And once people are maximizing and doing it in a consistent fashion, then you have implications about their behavior. And sometimes you have a rich set of implications, sometimes they're more limited, but you always have some. You can make it non-tautological, and you can make it interesting. And I think in all these areas, you can get interesting implications out about the behavior, whether it's judges or other people, in, you know, criminals or anybody else you're referring to.
Well, Gary, speaking of these public sector people like judges, when you started writing about politics in the 50s, you were kind of a Schumpeterian, you know, believing that we have a ruling class, potentially ruling class, the members of which compete with each other for votes, which are like, sales, purchases by consumers. And then later, your emphasis shifted to interest groups. So what explains that shift?
Well, I began to think that voting was, models of voting were not the right way to approach the political process. Even though we all vote, and obviously decisions.
Some of us vote.
People vote, half the population votes, and majority wins, and as in the Bush-Gore
well, the
contest.
majority.
No, maybe not the majority, but the majority of electoral votes, or whatever. That people, an old idea that people's incentives to vote for their interests are very weak because they don't have any influence. And so, under the impetus of work being done by people like George Stigler in particular and others, I began to shift my attention to the role of interest groups. They, I thought, were more fundamental in the political process, whether you had voting or not. They would be relevant in a non-democratic government as well as in a democratic government. They are relevant in a non-democratic government as well as in a democratic government. And that they will buy votes, not literally go out and buy them, but by influencing how people vote through advertising, propaganda, campaign contributions, and the like. And that, therefore, the right way to understand the political process is if we can get a good understanding of which interest groups have power, how they compete for each other, and as a result of that, which public policies get adopted. So that's the shift I made in my thinking about it. And a shift I've continued to believe in. I believe that people who assume that voters vote their self-interest are largely assuming that voters are irrational in a certain sense, and that it's a misguided extension of the theory of rational choice that we have for consumer behavior into the political process.
But aren't you implying that democratic and non-democratic governments are identical?
Not identical, because the interest groups that may be powerful in these different governments may be
Why?
different. Let me just finish this thought, and I'll try to come out to why. That they may be different, but that they're very similar in sense that the underlying structure is the power of different interest groups. That I do believe. Now, why may different interest groups be more powerful in different systems? That's not so difficult to see, although I would confess that we don't know a lot about those differences. For example, if we do have voting, and I'm an interest group that's based upon, let's say, protecting the environment, I may be relatively easy for this group to influence voters in my favor than it would be for me to influence a Stalin to vote to want to protect the environment. That Stalin is one individual. The voters are a collection of individuals, each without a self-interest in what they want to do. And while everybody may be persuadable, I think the theory of rational choice says that people who are voting in situations where they don't have any direct instrumental influence over the outcome, their votes are more vulnerable to advertising and propaganda. Now, where we don't know is exactly, how the precise way in which that works itself out. But in fact, if you look at, Casey Mulligan just had a paper on whether democracies or totalitarian systems spend different amounts or in different forms on Social Security. He couldn't find any systematic relation. So maybe they are pretty similar in some ways.